So first of all, I want to welcome you all to the third day of Athlone Castle's celebration of the Heritage Week. Today we have a very special guest with us, Dr. Kieran O'Connor, who is an expert in studies of castles in Ireland. He is a senior lecturer in the Department of Archaeology, School of Geography, Archaeology and Irish Studies in NUI Galway. He has done extensive research on castles, medieval landscape, medieval rural settlement, and late medieval Gaelic Ireland. And we are very lucky to have him here today with us, talking about the three royal castles, and Athlone, Rindoon and Roscommon. So without further ado, again, I want to welcome Kieran with us.
Well, thank you very much, Joanna, for introducing me there. The title of the talk is basically three royal castles, actually west of the Shannon in certainly what was Roscommon. Athlone was in Roscommon up to 1898, but the three royal castles, Athlone, Rindoon and Roscommon. So I'll just go forward. So let's just talk a little bit about castles, what they were. You see an image there of Roscommon Castle and a Phillips 1685 view of Athlone Castle. So castles can be defined as having been the seriously defended residence of people of lordly ranks, including minor knights, magnates, or great princes, kings. Now that's important for Athlone, Rindoon, and Roscommon, as the lord of the castle was the King of England as Lord of Ireland. So effectively they were royal castles. The actual ultimate guy, although he actually never visited the place, was actually the King of England as Lord of Ireland. In terms of date, the first castles in Ireland, there's a debate about this, you know, but we'll say for the sake of argument, the first castles in Ireland that archaeologists today would mainly accept as having been castles date to the 12th century and are mostly built by the incoming Anglo-Normans. And castles continue to be built up to the mid-17th century. But castles obviously had defensive functions, but they also had other functions. They were administrative centers. They were the centers of landed estates. Some land was rented out to people of lower status, but some land was farmed directly by the castle itself. So that meant castles often had agricultural and administrative buildings around them that have now, if you like, gone because they were originally made of timber or cob. But castles were also the means by which the lordly class, if you like, including kings and princes, but also minor knights and ordinary knights, displayed their high status. So castles were often placed within deliberately designed landscapes, you know, things like deer parks, et cetera, to emphasize this power. Very often towns with market functions were founded beside castles as well, particularly important ones, just like the royal castles at Athlone, Rindoon, and Roscommon. So remember, they're not these castles that we're looking at today. You can see two images of Rindoon Castle there, also had functioning towns beside them with market and fair functions. Maybe a little bit of industrial activity going on too. Okay. Now, the other thing too, as an introduction, how do we study castles? Well, you can see the various methods and sources we use there. There's Dan Titch-Tyler's very interesting reconstruction of the town and castle at Rindoon. It's now just a greenfield site, as many of you know, around the year 1280. But we use a multidisciplinary approach to study castles. Evidence from archaeology, history, historical geography, literature, maps, early maps. You'll see all this during the course of the talk. Okay, what else can we say? Just as a little warning there. Castles, churches, and medieval buildings often have a number of phases visible in their architecture. That's important. Okay, right. So this is just showing you the location of Athlone, the map on the right, Rindoon and Roscommon. Note that the castles and towns of those three places are really in a frontier area during the 13th and 14th century, on the border, if you like, between areas of quite intensive Anglo-Norman stroke English settlement and those areas controlled by the Gaelic Irish. In particular, we'll say in the Roscommon area, the O'Connors. And I often, you know, when we started working on these castles, we often wondered, well, is the fact that it's located in a frontier area, in terms, if we look at the historical evidence, these castles are regularly attacked. So is that fact reflected in the architecture? And just quickly, we can also see that other Anglo-Norman castles existed in the South Roscommon area during the 13th and early 14th century. Dundonald there, a lot of work carried out by Daniel Curley, who I'd say a lot of you know, who runs the Rathcrohan Visitor Centre there in Tusk. Ona Castle, maybe Dundonald, a ringwork castle, I would suggest, with timber defences. And then there's the very fine Mott and Bailey Castle in South Roscommon at Cloonburren, Mott and Bailey. So, you know, while Athlone, Rindoon and Roscommon were royal castles, these other castles were held by ordinary barons and knights. Now there is the phase plan from Rory Sherlock's got a very fine guidebook on Athlone Castle. So we're going to look at Athlone Castle first, the first of our three castles. And again, you can immediately see from that plan, when I said castles have a number of phases visible within them, they are inhabited for centuries, and social, defensive, and political needs change over time. So there's rebuilding, repurposing, et cetera, et cetera. You know, a castle isn't just one phase, it can be many phases. Well, you can see that there in that phase plan. But anyway, in terms of Athlone Castle, the Justiciar John de Grey, who is also the Bishop of Norwich, mixing politics and religion there, on the instruction of King John, if you like, the villain, one of the villains of the Robin Hood legend, orders a castle to be built at Athlone as well as a bridge. This castle at that stage protected the western border of the Anglo-Norman colony and controlled a crossing point over the Shannon. So what type of castle was it originally? We know what it looks like now, and we can see all those different phases. But what did the castle look like originally? Well, again, there's a bit of a debate about this, because we know in 1129, Turlough O'Connor, King of Connacht, built a castle at Athlone. He also built a bridge across the Shannon. There's also a possibility that before that stone castle was built in 1210, that maybe the de Lacings built a castle, possibly a ringwork castle here at Athlone, and opened in the 1190s. But as Sherlock states in that guidebook, this is very unclear and open to the debate. In 1210, the Annals of Lochkey state that the royal castle, built at the orders of King John and John de Grey, replaced, who was the justiciar or king's governor in Ireland, replaced an O'Connor castle. The main point, one point here anyway, is that Athlone's strategic importance had been recognized long before the coming of the Anglo-Normans. So many Anglo-Norman castles, as we know, were built on the sites of pre-existing native Irish fortresses and settlements. So there does appear to have been something at Athlone before 1210. And it probably was some form of timber fortification, maybe in the ringwork or ringwork style. But what about the castle as built, the stone castle as built in 1210? What did that look like? Well, again, if you look at that phased plan, you can see that 13th century stonework exists, dating to, we'll say, 1210, and maybe a couple of years later, exists on the western edge of the standing castle today, and also that the keep or the great tower in the center of the castle also appears to be original. That dates to 1210 and those years after it, okay? So how do we know this? Well, things like diagonal tooling on dressed stone, the way the dressed stone that we see, we'll say particularly to the western curtain wall of the castle, blocked up arrow loops and things like that, all show what the original castle, you know, the architecture or the stonework that dates to that original phase. Now there you see on the western side of the site, you can see, I'll just see if you can see that, you see that, a blocked up arrow loop. And we also have diagonal tooling on the dressed stone. You see those 45-degree chisel marks. That's a sure sign of 13th century work, and it appears to be original. Okay, so by looking at things like blocked up arrow loops, diagonally tooled stone, the great tower in the center of the site, we get an idea of what the castle would have looked like. Or, okay, we also have early maps, and there you have Phillips's 1685 plan of Athlone Castle, again showing us what was in place at that time. So Sherlock and Dan Titch-Tyler, working at Athlone, have created, if you like, a reconstruction of what that castle started in 1210, maybe it took a few years to build, looked like when first built. And that's interesting. You can see the kind of curving shape of the curtain wall. You can see rectangular towers, rectangular gatehouses, the keep, which we can still see the remains of today, although it was heavily modified around the year 1800. And also, what's also interesting, there appears to have been an outer ward. Sherlock and Titch-Tyler argue that this outer ward, you know, in other words, this area here, can you see my arrow there, was defended in timber. So we had a stone masonry castle with a great tower at its core, masonry walls and towers in the inner ward, defended also, we think, by a timber hoarding, and then an outer ward defended in timber. Okay, now that, I know you're going to say the outer ward looks as if it's stonework. Well, actually, the argument is that possibly it was originally built of timber. Okay, so that's the idea there. So that's just a reconstruction, maybe 1215 or so. I know I say 1211, 1212 there, but we'll say 1215 as to what that castle built at Athlone by de Grey on the orders of King John looked like. The other point too is that when we look at Phillips's 1685 map and depiction of the castle, you know, an early map, remember we said we use them to study medieval castles as well. In that outer ward, here's the outer ward or lower ward here, you see it just there. You can see the remains of what appear to be a gatehouse. What date is this gatehouse? Well, again, when we look at the historical sources, I argued that that gatehouse dates to the 1270s, that there was building work here in the 1270s. There certainly appears to have been, at Athlone Castle, a rebuilding of the lower or upper ward at Athlone Castle. But I notice that Sherlock and I think Titch Tyler have argued that it's actually 14th century in date. So there's a little bit of a debate there. But the main point is that basically the castle as built in the early 13th century had two wards. There may have been massive rebuilding in the 1270s to counter the threat of the O'Connors and the Gaelic resurgence, or maybe that massive rebuilding of that lower ward or whatever was later in the 14th century. Now, my own feeling is if we look at that plan there of the gatehouse there, you can see there's there's a protrusion at the back. And when we look at the 1580 map of the 13th century castle at Roscommon, we see something similar. So I think there are similarities between the late 13th century gatehouse at Roscommon and this one that no longer exists in the lower ward at Athlone. I think it's the Loon Gallery and the church to the north of the present castle, that sort of open area to the north of the standing remains is where that lower ward existed. Okay, so there's again Dan Titch Tyler's reconstruction of, actually they're arguing the 14th century, I'm arguing maybe a little bit earlier, okay, of Athlone Castle. So this being the lower ward. Okay, and here is that gatehouse. They're basing their argument on 14th century gatehouses in England having those very prominent towers at the front, not just jutting out to the front, but to the side as well. So there's your reconstruction of Athlone Castle. So we're seeing different phases at the castle being built over time. And as I say here, as I said before, castles were lived in for centuries and were constantly being repaired, rebuilt, new phases built as social, political, and defensive needs change. Okay, but we do also know, for example, from Philip's 1685 view of Athlone Castle, that a large Renaissance influenced Tudor house was rebuilt or built in the upper ward at Athlone Castle in the later 16th century, possibly by, or probably by Sir Nicholas Malby, the new English Lord President of Connaught, around, say, 1580 or so. So there's Phillips's view circa 1685. Note the transomed and mullioned windows of that house built up against the eastern curtain, the riverside curtain of the upper ward at Athlone. Okay, and note too that if we go over here to Roscommon, similar transomed and mullioned windows built by the same man are still extant. So the windows that we see here, that's the type of window that we would have seen at Athlone in that Tudor house, built up against that riverside curtain in the upper ward, okay? So that is that, we're moving on to the next, now hold on now, why won't that move on? Sorry, for some reason it's, oh, there we go, yeah. Okay, we're now going on to the second royal castle, Rindoon. Actually, one of the most interesting medieval sites in these islands, and I am not exaggerating. We bring our students there every year, and I'd like to thank the landowner there, PJ Grady, who's become a great friend over the years, for allowing access for our students to the site over many years now, 20 years. Anyway, okay, here we have Rindoon Castle. Now, again, you know, rather like Athlone, but in a way much more obvious because it's a deserted medieval town. There isn't, modern buildings over it. We can see that Rindoon isn't just a castle. The castle is the major monument within a complex of medieval monuments. It's basically a deserted medieval town with a very fine castle on its edge. So there you can see the Rindoon Peninsula. There's the castle. Here is the castle. This is here the gatehouse and keep of the castle. Again, it was built to rivet royal power over Connacht. It was founded in 1227 to rivet royal Anglo-Norman control over Connacht, and also to control the Shannon River system as well. As I say, an English town was founded there too. And you can see that reconstruction of that town and castle around the year 1280 down below. But apart from the castle, as I say, the remains of this medieval town many of the original buildings of this medieval town can be seen. There you can see the remains of the medieval hospital of the Crutch Friars on the edge of the town. Again, things like diagonal tooling help us figure out what was original to the 13th century in this particular building and what is later. But an actual hospital run by a religious order known as the Crutch Friars, these all occur at Rindoon. So it's not just the castle. We have very fine town walls dating to the early 13th century as well. So the castle was founded with a town, in conjunction with a town. And much of the archaeology of that 13th century town is still surviving. We can still see the walls. They've been conserved by the Heritage Council. There's Dan Titch-Tyler's reconstruction of those walls. We've got the remains of a medieval parish church. We've worked out where the marketplace was located through geophysical survey. So the castle did not stand in isolation. That castle, which was founded in 1227, a royal castle, was not founded in isolation. And the same can be said of Athlone and Roscommon as well. Now we'll just turn to the castle. And again, at Rindu, there is the great, if you like, the whole keep and the gatehouse photograph to your left. And there is a phased plan of Rindoon Castle carried, if you like, created by myself and Paul Nasons. And again, you can see all the different phases. Okay, so that point there, that a castle does not just belong to one period, it's multi-period. And it's the role, if you like, of the archaeologist and architectural historian to actually figure out what castles looked like when they were originally built and how they changed over time. And as I said earlier, a multidisciplinary approach is the best way to do this. We know that the castle, one of the reasons that the castle is located where it is because of the great, and indeed the town is located where it is because of the fantastic harbour facilities there on the peninsula, a place called appropriately Safe Harbour today. And we actually seem to have the remains of a 13th century quay complex there as well, which is quite interesting. Slipways and docks and things like that, and stone jetties. But again, looking at that, what did the castle, just like Athlone, what did that castle look like when first built? Founded in 1227, and we think the first masonry castle there was finished by about 1235 or so. Well, we know that the hall, keep, and gatehouse, the 3-story gatehouse, which was once very impressive, it had a barbican in front of it, dates to that primary phase. Note the cap towers as well on the corners of the hall keep. And these all made this building very, very impressive. So one of the things that's quite interesting is that the main buildings of Rindoon Castle, right from the beginning, dominate the approaches to the castle, are all on the side of the marketplace. They dominate the landward and lake approaches to the castle. They are not hidden away behind all this. They actually dominate the marketplace, the harbour, and the approach through the town, the main buildings of the castle, right from the beginning. Now, what else can we say? Well, we've worked out what curtain walls were original to the castle. And one of the things that we notice is that there weren't flanking towers, circular or, as in the case of Athlone, rectangular shaped. And one of the things at this time was you needed control of the base of the curtain wall militarily, defensively. And of course, flanking towers achieved this. So initially we were a bit puzzled, but then we realized that the top of the curtain wall in this first phase, 1227, 1235, was surmounted by a heavy timber hoard. And here, for the first phase, you can see the remains, and somewhere out here, you can see the remains of the joist holes for this timber hoard. So something like this here existed on top of the curtain wall at Rindoon, all the way along here, quite similar to Sherlock and Titch Tyler's reconstruction of Athlone Castle that I showed you a while ago. So timber hoard and defenders can come out and fire downwards at attackers at the base of the curtain wall. Okay, so they hop out over the battlements onto the timber hoard, which is jutting out, and they fire downwards and do away or wound attackers hitting the base of the curtain wall. So timber hoarding was the way most of the base of the curtain wall or the defenses of the curtain wall was achieved at Rindoon in this first phase in 1227, 1235. Anglo-Norman Castle. And there's just a reconstruction, again by Dan, of timber hoarding surmounting the curtain wall of Rindoon. And here's the hall keep and the gatehouse. Okay, and here are, you can see boats in the harbour and things like that. But we also, at Athlone, we discussed what was there beforehand as well. And, a very fine Anglo-Norman castle, royal castle, being founded at Rindoon in 1227, probably finished, that first castle finished by about 1235. But was there something there beforehand? Were the, if you like, was that royal castle at Rindoon the first occupation of the Great Peninsula and site of Rindoon? And the answer is no. There appears to have been quite an important Irish monastery located during the early medieval period at Rindoon. Brian Shanahan has shown this in his work, that the site of the later hospital was the site of an important early monastery. Metalworking, very fine metalwork has been found at the site. Cross slabs have been found at the site. So there seems to have been an important ecclesiastical centre at Rindoon before the coming of the Normans and the building of the royal castle in 1227. But we also, if we look at that blue phase there, that dates to around 1300 or so. Ignore that. That is completely 1300. But the original castle, stone castle, as built in 1227, seems to have been created within an oval-shaped earthwork, a curving oval-shaped earthwork. Now, no 13th century castle built on new ground would look like that. And a new castle built on a greenfield site in the early 13th century, I mean, this is quite similar to Athlone as well, would have had straight walls with flanking towers with an external fosse. The fact that it's curving, that it seems to be within an oval enclosure, is a strong hint that this royal castle, started in 1227, was built on top of the site of a pre-existing Irish fortification. Now, the only pre-Norman reference is Rory O'Connor, King of Connacht, bringing his fleet from Gailey up Loch Ree to Rindoon. So our feeling there is the strong hint that there's a pre-Norman O'Connor fortress under Rindoon. Now, somebody's tried to argue that there may have been a Viking long fort as well, but basically the very fine harbour facilities at Rindoon may have attracted the O'Connors to build or rebuild a fortress, a timber fortress defended with timber defences at Rindoon. And that's why the later Anglo-Norman stone castle has that sort of shape to it, okay? So that would be our reading of that. Now, obviously that has to be proved by excavation, but we know that the O'Connors are building fortifications throughout the 12th century at strategic locations within their kingdom. And if any location along the Shannon is strategic, apart from Athlone, it's Rindu. Okay? So there's a strong, let's put it this way, there's good evidence that the Irish had long recognized Rindoon's strategic importance way before the arrival of the Anglo-Normans. Let's go back to the castle again, the Anglo-Norman royal castle at Rindoon. Well, we know that A. O'Connor, King of Connacht, destroyed Rindoon Castle, leveled it in, I think, 1272. It's an early manifestation of the Gaelic resurgence in Roscommon. However, like Athlone at this time, remember we said that Rindoon was heavily refortified by the Dublin government after this event. And you can see that here. This we see as the timber herding holes, blocked up arrowloops from that first phase dating to 1227. You see the building line here? Actually, you can just about make out crenellations here, this sort of area. But anyway, it doesn't matter. You see the building line here? This seems to be work of the 1270s when the castle was rebuilt and more heavily fortified. The wall was raised about 2 meters, but again, control of the base of the curtain wall was gained by placing a new timber herd over the top of the wall. Okay, so something like this again. So timber herding is used in both the first phase and the second phase of this royal castle at Rindoon to control the base of the curtain wall, to fire down at attackers at the base. Going forward, yeah. And again, another phase too, we see a hall being added to the south of the castle around the year 1300. And that's strange from a defensive point of view. But anyway, it's again, and something I'll come to now in a minute, it's placed there to continue that theme that we saw right from the beginning, right from 1227, the whole northwestern face of the castle, the main buildings of the castle being placed there in a long line, all keep 3-story gatehouse and barbican, and now this secondary hall dominating the natural approach to the castle this way. Sorry, sorry, I'm doing something wrong. Back, I shouldn't play around. Where are we? There we are, yeah. And then the lakeward approach and the marketplace is here. But anyway, the main buildings of the castle dominating the natural approach and to the site, to the castle, and the natural approaches to the castle and the marketplace. The new hall also used timber herd to be defended. And we also have a 2-story wooden lavatory tower built up against its northwestern front in a very public place fronting the marketplace. Okay, and there's Dan Tyler's reconstruction of the castle. Again, I think that, you know, again, Roscommon County Council's heritage officer and the Heritage Council paid for these reconstruction drawings. But anyway, there's a reconstruction of the castle, the main buildings of the castle dominating the marketplace and the approaches to the castle. And that's important. But we also know that the area to the southeast of the castle and the town was uninhabited, and it functioned as a deer park. It had a fish pond, mill, and rabbit warren, we think, within it. So the deer park framed the castle with a semi-sylvan semi-wooded backdrop, and added to the castle's architectural statement of royal power and elite status. So it's very interesting that the deer park framing the castle, but also the great buildings of the castle dominating and overawing the marketplace, you know, real statements of royal power, I think, at Rindu. Okay, so that is going forward. Yeah, there's the fish pond at Rindoon. Again, I think it was Brian Shanahan who figured out this, discovered this site. Okay, so the other thing too, we find, unlike Athlone, the Gaelic resurgence, the townsfolk had deserted Rindoon by about 1320. It slowly transitions into a rural landscape. The castle, however, remains in the hands of the Dublin government until about 1340 or so, when it fell into Irish hands. Now, what happens here is the castle seems to have been deliberately destroyed at some stage after this, and the town walls were left to decay. Now, while it's not shown in the plans, we can see the remains of masonry that have been tumbled in the mid-14th century by the Irish. We see also that the whole keep was undermined at this time as well. And people often say, oh, they must have used gunpowder. No, they don't seem to have. They seem to have used fire and manual labor to do this. We see something similar at Clonmacnoise, and possibly Dunamace Castle as well, where the native Irish, instead of using the castle, destroy it so it can't be reused by the Dublin government or Anglo-Normans again, okay? There. But what we find, again, is that Rindoon's story is not over, because it has a late Tudor phase as well. It seems to have been rebuilt and reused in the late 1570s. Standing stretches of the 13th century wall were repaired and rebuilt, and then where the wall had been fully destroyed, new stretches of wall were built at this time. Loads of gun route loops are associated with this late phase too. And here from the interior of the castle, you can see gun loops, but you can see the 13th century wall. It's thicker than the late 16th century repairs, different stonework as well. So we're getting a late Tudor phase here at Rindoon as well. It isn't just a 13th century, early 14th century Anglo-Norman castle. The Dublin government appear to have done this. The castle was probably, again, due to its strategic location, was presumably important during the 9 Years' War, but it seems to have been deserted again in the early 17th century and remained so until the 19th century, when a traditional cottage was built within it, belonging to a cattle herd, I suppose linked to the farm at St. John's House nearby. Okay, so that's Rindoon Castle. So you see the different phases there. You see how we've figured it out. Okay, so Roscommon Castle is our third royal castle. Okay. Okay, so we know that the castle was started in 1269. We know that from the historical sources that, again, a royal castle was started in 1269, not 1169, 1269, was started by the justiciar, the King's Governor in Ireland. It was built, its purpose was to control A. O'Conor, the then Gaelic King of Connacht, who caused a lot of trouble attacking and raiding the Anglo-Norman colony, both in Connacht and further afield. So why was this great Anglo-Norman castle? Because it is a fantastic castle, as you'll see. top-rate castle by international standards. Why was this castle sited at Roscommon where it is? Well, we know again, rather like Rindoon, and by the way, there also appears to have been an early medieval monastery at Athlone. A very important monastery had been founded at Roscommon. It had transitioned into an Augustinian foundation and center of learning in the 12th century. We know a Dominican priory was founded at Roscommon by the O'Connors in 1253. All the indications was that there was a substantial lay population, if you like, a small Irish town in existence at Roscommon, quite an important metalworking center, quite an important center of learning, an important place, if you like, by 1269. That's one of the reasons why a castle was built by the Dublin government at Roscommon at that time. Again, we know too, like so many of these important Gaelic sites, a secular power centre existed at Roscommon as well. There was an O'Connor fortification here, and it seems to have been located, according to Margaret Murphy, it seems to have been located on a crannog sited out in the lake to the west of the later castle. And I think that's Brian Shanahan's drawing there. There's the castle, and there's the earlier O'Connor crannog, and there's a reconstruction of what a crannog looked like. Doran has shown that Roscommon lay at the junction of important medieval roadways as well. There was the Hind to the south of Roscommon, just to the south, appears to have been canalized from the 12th century onwards. This is an important centre. So it's an important O'Connor economic, cultural and political centre by the 13th century. And with the Dublin government choosing it as a location for Roscommon, they took over this centre, they prized it away from Hugh or A. O'Connor at this time, and it's a considerable blow to his power and prestige. So, but at the same time, it's also another example, like Athlone and Rindoon, where an Anglo-Norman castle was inserted into a prosperous native Irish landscape and where they took over a wealthy existing Irish centres. Okay, so, the castle, royal castle, started in 1269. We know from the sources that it was mostly built, however, in the 1270s. Hugh was not happy, or A. O'Connor was not happy with this, constantly attacked the building works as they were in progress. Then he dies, and it becomes a little bit easier for the Dublin government to build Roscommon Castle. But anyway, it's not immediately clear at present, but it appears that the location within Roscommon was carefully thought out, because a lake existed to the west and northwest and southwest of the castle during that time, Loch Nanine, where that crannog had been located. So the waters of the lake, there's that later map, a late map showing the castle and the loch here, and the waters of the lake were used to feed the deep moat of the castle, things like that. Okay, so the castle was located in what now appears to be, quite low ground and things like that. But actually, during the time in the 13th century, it was quite a defensive location. The other thing that's interesting is that the backdrop of the lake would have been impressive and would have added to the statement of royal power that the castle's architecture, portrayed, as we'll see in a minute. And I was just going to say, in medieval literature, the ideal castle was regularly viewed across water. Okay. So, and you can see, written a bit about there. But anyway, there we go. There's Roscommon Castle from the west. So the location is quite interesting. An important O'Connor centre taken over, a rich centre taken over. Within the settlement itself, or in the vicinity of Roscommon, the Dublin government, the justiciar, the King's governor in Ireland, building that royal castle, carefully chooses the site to build his castle, building it beside a lake. Now here you can see Roscommon Castle from the east and northeast. You can see a plan of the castle as standing. Again, you know, the castle has never really been studied in depth until Margaret Murphy, as part of an MA under my direction, started to study it back about 15, 20 years ago. Okay, so a very fine castle, rectangular enclosure with flanking towers, a very fine, clearly late 13th, three-story originally, D-shaped, elongated D-shaped gatehouse, loads of garderobes or lavatories. Some of the rooms within the castle were en suite. We think that's a modern thing, but no, there. Okay, so a hall, maybe an undefended hall, I think existed here, an outer postern gate. But that was that was basically the standing remains of Roscommon Castle today. Here we have very fine with 4 angled towers, excellent accommodation at first floor level, maybe at second floor level as well, fireplaces, attached lavatories, accommodation was very fine. A real statement of Anglo-Norman power, but people have argued in the past that it was not a particularly well-defended fortress. Now, I've always had a problem with this interpretation, given the fact that the castle was lay on a military frontier, as I said earlier. Now, the first thing is when we look at the map, topographical plans and things like that, we realize that the outer ditch moat of the castle was between about 12 meters and 30 meters out from the walls of the castle. And what we began to realize that the standing remains of the castle, i.e. this plan here, okay, just going back to that, was actually an inner ward. So just like Athlone Castle, we began to realize that actually there was an outer ward as well, that the castle was actually much bigger than it now seems, okay? So I just say it there, simply put, the castle was much larger originally than the standing masonry remains suggest today. So there's again a reconstruction at the bottom there of what the castle looked like around 1280 with its inner and outer wards. So we have 2 lines of defense, if you like, at Roscommon, not just one, as was once thought. Okay, so, right, we started to see that there was this outer line of defense, geophysical survey, historical references in the historical sources, a little bit of excavation. We began to realize that actually there was an outer masonry wall to the castle. And we began to realize that just like royal castles, for example, like Harlech in England and places like that, that we had concentric defense, certainly on the eastern and southern sides of the castle originally. So the close nature from all that work that we did, a little bit of excavation, geophysical survey, you can see there's the ditch there, there's the wall of the castle, but we see another wall here, we see a tower there, some sort of Barbican tower, and there, okay? So basically, we found that the castle at Roscommon was much more complex and larger and better defended than we originally thought. Loads of arrow loops as well. So that's just a little bit about concentric defense, the 2 lines. So here's Carcassonne town walls. There's the inner line and there's the outer line. Closely linked, here's Harlech Castle, which was also built at the time of Edward I as well and is a royal castle, just like Roscommon, very similar, inner ward at Roscommon Castle, very similar to this. But there's the outer line of defense, concentric defense. You know, so we shouldn't be surprised that we see concentric defense at Roscommon in the 1270s, basically because ideas were passing backwards and forwards across the Irish Sea with the movement of masons and officials, royal officials, between the two islands. So basically then what we're trying to say is that Roscommon Castle, as started in 1269, but really built in the later 1270s, originally was larger than we see it today, had very fine accommodation within it, and also had concentric defense. So it can be compared very well to the great royal castles of North Wales, for example, Harlech, Beaumaris, Rhuddlan, etc. Again, all over the castle, when we started to look at the standing remains, loads of arrow loops, both within the flanking towers and we think within the curtain walls and battlements as well. This was a heavily defended castle, and that makes sense. Yes, it's got very fine accommodation. Yes, it's got very fine buildings within it, but it has excellent defenses right up to date for its time. This is a castle of European status. Okay, so that's the original Anglo-Norman castle as built in the late 13th, royal castle built in the late 13th century. The O'Connors, we'll just go on now, coming towards the end. The O'Connors take over Roscommon Castle around 1360. The Anglo-Norman stroke English are pushed out. But what's really interesting about that long Gaelic Irish occupation of the castle, which lasts until the mid 16th century, from 1360 or so, is that there's very little evidence for physical evidence for Gaelic Irish occupation of the castle. And again, I think that's more to do with the way Gaelic society was organized at the time, rather than some inability to build. So if we look at Roscommon in the mid 15th century, right at the time the O'Connors were controlling Roscommon Castle, or were in occupation of Roscommon Castle, the friary is completely rebuilt. The Dominican friary at Roscommon is completely rebuilt by the O'Connors under O'Connor patronage at this time. So all the skills and resources are there to carry out new works, but for the reasons linked to the way Gaelic society was organized, which in itself is a lecture, they chose not to do it. They just repaired what was there and continued to live there. But again, time moves on. With the Tudor, particularly Elizabethan reconquest of large parts of Ireland, we find that Roscommon, it comes back into Crown control. It's granted to that guy, we've met him before, Sir Nicholas Malby, who created a Tudor house on the upper ward at Roscommon Castle, and he builds a Renaissance influenced fortified house within the inner ward, the northern half of the inner ward at Roscommon. It is a massive fortified house. And you can see here the windows that he inserted into the 13th century building. In architectural terms, the Renaissance or Renaissance influenced architecture meant larger and more comfortable houses, more windows, much more light and comfort, provided with many fireplaces, and also the facades of the houses were symmetrical in design, emphasizing order and civility. Okay, so we can see a Renaissance house was built incorporating the late 13th century gatehouse and the northern half of the inner ward. And those windows were inserted. Large transept and mullioned windows, very similar to what Malby maybe did at Athlone Castle around the same time. But again, what was interesting, as I said earlier, that when we started to study the castle, we realized that the 13th century castle was much larger than we had originally thought. But we found that the late 16th century castle was also much larger than even the earlier castle, because a formal fortified garden was created to the east and north of the castle to reflect, if you like, the order and civility of the new fortified house. The old castle ditch was filled in, the garden wall with flanking gun towers with gun loops. Just there, we think there was a flanking tower there, and possibly somewhere here as well. A very high wall, as you can see, but within it, a garden was created. So in the late 16th century, a fortified garden was created to the east and north of the castle. And there's a reconstruction of Roscommon Castle as it would have looked around 1590. All the old defences of the 13th century had been taken down, the ditch had been filled in, the northern side of the ditch is turned into a garden pond. We have this geometric garden reflecting the symmetry of the fortified house, the Renaissance influenced house. So there you have a Tudor phase there as well. And Mulby was, there are defences kept, however. It is a fortified house. It isn't an undefended manor house. The castle is attacked during the 9 Years' War. It's attacked twice and besieged during the Confederate Wars of the 1640s. And then it's deliberately slighted and ruined at the start of the Williamite War in 1689, and it then becomes a ruin. So we've just run through then, if you like, I've come to the end now, we've just run through the architecture and some history of Athlone Castle, Rindoon Castle, and Roscommon Castle. And we can see that they had certain things in common. All are royal castles of 13th century date. In other words, the ultimate lord of the castle was the King of England as Lord of Ireland. All had very fine accommodation within them, I think, when we look. But they were also very well defended. Now, even if that defense was timber herding, control of the base of the curtain wall was achieved at Athlone, I think, to a certain extent, and certainly Rindoon by timber herding, by flanking towers and concentric defense at Roscommon too. But anyway, the main point is, I think when we've studied these castles, we realize that yes, they are great statements of royal power. They're absolutely fantastic accommodation within them, but they are quite well defended. They also all appear to be, well, certainly Athlone and Roscommon appear to have been much larger originally than they appear today. And we worked that out by using that multidisciplinary approach, evidence from history, historical geography, architectural analysis, and archaeology. We see, using that approach, that the castles had a number of phases within them. They're inhabited for centuries. And we see that at all three castles. Now, there is a phase at Rindoon where it appears to have been deserted for anything up to 200 years, actually, but it's refortified in Tudor times. Okay, so there's a number of phases. And again, to, if you like, work out those phases, we need to take that multidisciplinary approach that I've just said to you. The other thing too, I'll just finish on this. These are all in different ways. Certainly Athlone and Roscommon Castle are open to the public, and Rindoon sometimes is open to, I'm not sure what its exact status is at present. But these are immense draws, if you like. They really add to the cultural tourism product of, Westmeath, I suppose, in the case of Athlone, although it was Roscommon up to 1898, but we'll say no more. but Rindoon and Roscommon, you know, these are fantastic places, interesting places to visit. They add to the, if you like, the cultural tourism products on offer in places like Westmeath and Roscommon. And, you know, as a result, you know, bring, I suppose, indirectly, much needed money to a rural area like Roscommon. Okay, so I'll leave it there. Okay, so that's it, Joanna. So thank you for listening. And I'd just like to thank Joanna, Carmel, and David of the Athlone Castle Visitor Centre for organising this lecture. And thanks to the National Library for the use of various images. And thanks also to Dan Titch-Tyler for his fantastic reconstruction drawings of all three castles. I think, have I said thanks to Rory Sherlock and Jay Hall as well for giving me a huge amount of help with this lecture. So thank you very much. So that's it. Okay, over. Sorry if I went on too much, but there you go. Okay, is that okay?
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Kieran. It was a fascinating talk on the three castles, and I think we've all learned a good deal about the three sites.
It was brilliant, Kieran. Thanks so very much. Really interesting from our perspective, you know, to learn more. We think we know everything, but obviously we're not the experts. So thank you for sharing your expertise. And
no, thanks a lot.
We hope that you'll do another lecture very soon for us.
Yeah, anytime, absolutely. But you know, you know, if I just urge people to visit Athlone Castle and Roscommon Castle. You know, these places are open to the public. So, but I'd love to give a lecture again anytime. So thanks for all that.
I just want to say thank you, Kieran, again for a fascinating lecture. I wanted to thank the Heritage Council and the Irish World Town Network for funding our Heritage Week programme, including that talk. If for anyone who's interested, we have more interesting events coming up until the Sunday. So you can find the details of those on our website. So it's www.atlonecastle.ie/events. Thank you, everyone who participated, who joined us for this talk. And thank you, Kieran, again.
Yeah, thanks, Joanna.
Thanks, Amanda.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good day. Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.